Can everyone who wants to come in, come towards me? Yes, follow the Irish accent. Okay, that's it. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you here. It's been such an interesting day, and this is our final panel. Before I introduce the panelists, one thing I ask you is just at the end of the panel, I'm going to jump up and I'm going to say goodbye, and then Sergeant Svic is going to come up and he's going to give his closing remarks. So if you can just sit tight for an extra 3 minutes. Okay, really it's going to be 5 minutes, but let's just say 3. Okay, so our final panel is Kosovo and Serbia escaping the dead end. And our panelists are Besnik Bislimi, he will be online, Nikola Dimitrov, Jovana Radosavljevic, Dusan Janjic, Engjellushe Morina, and of course our guest, His Excellence Ambassador Christopher Hill. Thank you all.
So we just go to...
Okay, good. We managed. Do we have our other panelists online? Mr. Bislimi is here. Okay, so I will start with 2 challenges. In this panel, we have 2 challenges. It's the last panel. The room is full, and you probably are expecting an interesting interactive exchange and, considering the topic. So we will try to do that. The second challenge is we are 5 panelists and me, and we only have 1 hour. So that aside, I wanted to actually, until yesterday afternoon, to start on a positive note, because you, Mr. Bislimi, were on your way here, and just before you approached Belgrade, you were turned back, despite all the necessary procedures that you followed. You got a permit, so on and so forth. So unfortunately, I can't start on a positive note, but what I want to say is that there is still something that you may want to share very briefly. And so I'll start with you. If you could give us brief elaboration of the decision that was just taken. The media is telling us that there is a decision. But I want to ask all panelists, you as well, Mr. Bislimi, to stick to 4 minutes maximum in your interventions, so that we have some time for Q&A in the end. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Engjellushe. Thank you very much for arranging this virtual participation. I did not manage to come to Belgrade, but this still did not diminish my willingness to be part of this panel. To commend the last decision of the government, a decision that is less than 1 hour old, we decided today to make sure that after the deadline on the car plates conversion from illegal to legal car plates, we don't start with immediate measures, but we somehow have transitional stages when we will start first with only warnings for 3 weeks, starting from Tuesday until November 21st, where citizens that still have illegal car plates on their cars will get notifications of the need to convert their car plates as soon as possible. If this doesn't happen after 3 weeks, then the police will have to issue fines according to the law. If I'm not wrong, the amount of the fine will be 150 euros. And again, the instructions to convert the illegal car plates. And this will last for another 2 months until January 21st, when citizens will be given then temporary car plates in exchange for their old car plates. We hope that all this process will be finalized without any incidents by April 21st. If you remember, April 21st was the deadline for reaching an agreement for a permanent solution according to best EU standards and practices. We had created 2 working groups in Brussels with the idea to work for 6 months towards this solution. Unfortunately, the working groups could not submit a final proposal since there was zero willingness on the Serbian team to constructively participate and accept one of the proposals that was disseminated by the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Bislimi. Just to put it in a context, disagreements over car plates and some other agreements within the dialogue process facilitated by the EU have been ongoing, but this particular disagreement on car plates was supposed to end at the end of October, so there were a lot of worries and speculations about unrest and so on and so forth. So this hopefully will help de-escalate the situation. But I would suggest that we don't go into nitty-gritty details so much. We only have 1 hour. I want to go over to you, Dusan. Give us an idea. What is the atmosphere? What is happening in Serbia? There is the new government. Just give us a little bit of an elaboration, what to expect, of course, always with regards to Kosovo and the dispute with Kosovo.
Surely the atmosphere will be better than yesterday. And I'm sure that I will see Besnik Bislimi in Belgrade. Meaning we have now a new government. Yesterday was the old Minister of Internal Affairs. And hoping that the new government will accept seriously their duties to recovery dialogue, to participate in establishing, some kind of security on the north, and especially to cooperate with KFOR and other people to eliminate any risk of possibly armed incidents. Talking in the perspective, because Ambassador Hill said better than me, a few months, weeks on TV, national TV, I'm hoping that we will soon come to the political dialogue. The aim has to be political dialogue and to try to solve some issues and to come to some results in the next months. I'm not naive. I am quite young guy, but with some experience, meaning by definition, yes, I am pessimist. I'm a well-informed optimist. But something is possible to be done. Not the final comprehensive agreement, but some comprehensive agreement could achieve. That's something what I think the same government could accept, because the government is transitional, the president is longer transitional, but the issue is really historical and important for, and I'm finishing, for the development and history of those people, Albanians and Serbs. We have to be good neighbors for the moment. We have to stabilize and normalize the situation, but the first step in Serbia is to normalize Serbia.
I am very curious, of course, to hear what Ambassador Hill has to share with us, but Jovana, I want to go to you first because you live and work in north of Kosovo, so give us a brief feeling, if you can, of the environment in the north, and very briefly what you think about this decision taken just half an hour ago.
Well, to be honest, this decision came a bit unexpected. We really felt that Kosovo Prime Minister would actually go through with his refusal to extend the deadline for the re-registration process. But this decision is really not problem-solving. It's more of a face-saving for the Kosovo government and Kosovo Prime Minister toward his constituency, and because he actually ended up falling into the pressure of the other actors. This is not problem-solving, I must mention, for many reasons, because even though there have been incidents of the people who were victims of the arson attacks, this is something that we should not mistake for the reason for the unwillingness of people to re-register their vehicles. The real reason is the fact that this is a very impractical solution for the citizens. We as civil society have on multiple occasions expressed this to the Kosovo government, and these issues have not been addressed. There are people that have issues with obtaining Kosovo documents, which makes them ineligible to register their vehicles. In this process, people are not able to obtain driver's licenses, the Kosovo driver's licenses, which makes them in a position to illegally operate RKS vehicles in Kosovo. The process has been too short, now has been extended, but it still doesn't fix the problem, even though if people have to go through the driving school, there is not a single school in the north, and the couple of those that exist in the South Mitrovica do not offer actually classes in Serbian. So it really makes it impossible for people. Just for a quick comparison, there have been 2 more rounds of the re-registration processes of the vehicles, and I actually participated in the one from 2018. But it was much better in comparison to this one because it actually took into consideration the needs of the communities. Also, there was an option to select either status neutral KS plates or the RKS plates. People could obtain the driver's licenses, and most importantly, there was an invitation from Srpska Lista to actually participate in the re-registration process. Still, only a couple of hundreds of vehicles were registered at the time. So to conclude on this, first, for the Kosovo government, it's really important to readdress this decision and to go through and solve the practical issues that people are facing in the process, but also to keep in mind that all of the issues that are concerning the Serbian community in Kosovo, until the comprehensive agreement is reached, and even after, has to be brought based on informed decision-making on the needs of the communities on the ground and in cooperation with Serbia. This is only when we can expect the actual successful implementation of these decisions.
So expectations were not met, that's
No.
what you're saying. Okay. Ambassador Hill, when I heard that you were appointed to come to Serbia as the ambassador, I was very enthusiastic. Not just me, but many people who deal with the region, people from the region, outside of the region, considering your career, considering your experience in the region. And now I don't know what to say. Are you
You're
optimistic
not enthusiastic anymore.
anymore? I want to hear
Sorry.
from you, actually.
Yeah.
How enthusiastic are you that by the time you leave, you're going to turn back and say, this is a good kind of wrap-up of my career?
Well, I don't consider myself quite wrapped up, but I'll ignore that and move on. You know, I have not been back in the Balkans or worked in the Balkans for some 23 years. I left after Rambouillet and actually in the context of this NATO bombing campaign. So I left in the summer of 1999. And then I went on to other places, Poland, I was in South Korea, I was in Asia more generally, and of course I was also working in Iraq. It's always important to go to these other places because to understand that while you're in the Balkans, there is a kind of notion that, my goodness, this is where all problems seem to start and where they never seem to finish. And so, but when you get outside, you realize there are a lot of other things going on. And certainly as we gather here tonight, we realize that we have a war which will live in infamy for many, many decades, maybe centuries. People will remember what one neighbor did to another, what Russia has done to its neighbor, Ukraine. It's an appalling situation. And coming right after the pandemic, frankly, given what's happened to world energy supplies, food supplies, European security, you could really call what Russia has become a sort of second pandemic. So with that understanding, and then coming back to the Balkans, I was kind of surprised to see that this Serbia-Kosovo issue remains, and with kind of the same level of sort of emotion about the problems. And frankly speaking, as a career diplomat who kind of tries to look at these things in a broader historical arc, it was, to put it mildly, disappointing. You know, in any negotiation, you have always a kind of conflict between the urgent and the important. The important, which could be clearly seen way back in 1999, was how was this going to work? How was this situation of Kosovo essentially being removed, and not very many happy people about that around here in Serbia, being removed from Serbia, given to UNMIK, given to NATO to run. Then some 9 years later, with a declaration of independence, which for many people in Serbia is simply something they have not been able to reconcile themselves. So if you're a negotiator, how do you deal with this? Well, what you try to do is deal with the broader important issues. How can you create a circumstance where Serbs in Serbia, Albanians in Kosovo, or more broadly, the Kosovo people, how can they have a kind of normalized relationship? How can you create a circumstance where the border works, where there are kind of mechanisms for dealing with this? And then over time, you can see the development not of ethnically based interests, but perhaps different kinds of interests. You know, parties who are ethnically divided may come together over an issue of taxation or something. So you kind of hope that you can replace some of these issues that drove the crisis in the Balkans in the 1990s, and you would like to have seen that things have changed. And I'm kind of disappointed, frankly, with where we are. I was encouraged by the fact that senior leadership in Europe, France and Germany, kind of stepped in and said, look, our aspirations for the Brussels dialogue process was not as an emergency dispute mechanism resolution process. Our aspirations was to kind of set a broader, frankly, more important standard to see whether this could all be calmed down. Because at a certain point, if the countries in the Balkans cannot resolve issues, they become less desirable candidates for, frankly, where this should all end up. This should all end up in a European Union. So to see what has happened today, where the first few minutes of this, more than the first few minutes, we were talking about license plates. We weren't talking about, you know, what the future of the Serb community is in Kosovo. Is there a future for the Serb community? If there is, what are the rules that would make people comfortable about staying? We have not talked about the broader issues of what is the internationalization, what's the scope for Kosovo in the future? What are the membership aspirations that Kosovo has had? No, we have allowed important issues like that to be cast aside because they're not nearly as fun as talking about license plates. So I'm very disappointed about it. I'm disappointed to see the issue of electricity in northern Kosovo go on and on for months and months without any resolution because of really small items. And meanwhile, we have this situation in Ukraine, and I can tell you, centuries from now, we won't be talking about people won't be talking about license plates in Kosovo. They'll be talking about this barbaric attack by Russia on its neighbor, and that is the issue that should all concern us. I mean, in addition to food, in addition to energy, we've been talking about nuclear weapons lately. Have you noticed? It's more important than license plates. But so I'm a little disappointed that the Balkans has really kind of turned even more inward than I thought even possible in the 1990s. Sorry to go on, but I had to.
Thank you. I am very curious to talk about the bigger picture, especially the Franco-German latest initiative. But before we do that, Nikola, it's great that you're part of the panel because we can have a look from a regional perspective. So this dispute between Kosovo and Serbia, it's not only hampering developments in Kosovo, in the north of Kosovo, Serbia, so on and so forth, but it's also hampering political and economic developments of the region. As a former Macedonian foreign minister and deputy prime minister, how do you see this obstacle being overcome and prosperity for the region? In 4 minutes.
Yes. First
I
of all,
broke my 4 minutes. I'm very sorry about that.
I think we managed to make some progress in the region, and I think it's fair to give that credit where credit is due. The name issue was seen as one of the 3 intractable, impossible to solve disputes in the Balkans. We did that, and maybe, and I approach this with a measure of modesty, I'm not comparing it, those are different issues, of course, but maybe for the audience here, for the public in Serbia and in Kosovo, it will be useful to hear how we did it. I think, and then at the end I will actually answer your question. First of all, it's about facing reality, recognizing that you're responsible also when you miss opportunities. So conduct, of course, brings responsibility, political responsibility, but also omissions. So even though it sometimes seems the easiest thing to do for politicians is to ignore a problem, that also bears responsibility. We wanted to do it. So there was an intention, I think, in both capitals, in both governments at the time. For their own reasons, we wanted to do it. For me, this was an important step in finalizing our statehood. In some countries, at the United Nations, we used to be called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, with this provisional reference. The name issue had become an anchor that was bringing us down, blocking our future. And, you know, on my 14th day as a foreign minister, my first bilateral visit was to Athens. I went there to say, it's time to do this. If you want to have a predictable, friendly, European, reliable friend to your north, let's do it. It wasn't easy. I became a traitor for parts of my compatriots, for some a hero, the same with Minister Koutsias, not to speak about the 2 prime ministers, Tsipras and Zaev. At first, it was a cautious examination of the other. Are they serious? Do they really want to do this? The blame game stopped. Usually, if you see a blame game, it's a signal that there are no serious negotiations behind the scenes.
I wanted to come back to lessons learned and ask you what is it that you could share with us as lessons learned, but I wanted to do that a little bit further.
So I'll skip that part. I'm going to essentially say that it's never wise to ignore problems. They become crises in the making, and they grow. That's the trouble with problems. In our experience, bilateral disputes that are emotional defocus from the real problems of the countries. So for some politicians, including in my own capital, in Skopje, the name issue was handy to cover corruption or other forms of bad governance. If you don't have a cover, a defocus, all of a sudden the real issues come to the surface. They're exposed. So I think this geopolitical moment with this brutal war, aggression of Putin's Russia in Ukraine, maybe we have to try, as a region, to do our part of the responsibility. We are not the center of the world. We are not even the center of the continent. We are still, I think, relevant. And we should do our part. I think we have to get out of the trenches of history. We have this habit of an unhealthy competition. Who is the biggest victim of history? And solve our problems. This is not, we are not involved. We are neighbors with both Serbia and Kosovo. But in terms of the region, this is an impediment detrimental to regional cooperation, which is quite obvious, to European accession as well. This is also quite obvious. So, and also, I think we need more togetherness, come together as a region, because it's really difficult to make it as one country if the others are not successful as well. So, as benevolent neighbors, we have a stake to see a prosperous, forward-moving Serbia, a prosperous Kosovo, and all the other countries in the region. We have a stake. And to the extent that we can be helpful, of course, we should play sort of a positive role without the ambition to, give lessons. We approach this with modesty.
So both you and Ambassador Hill mentioned, of course, the war in Ukraine and the developments in Europe, and obviously there has been all the right statements with regards to the region coming from Europe, and also this more intensified diplomatic initiative coming directly from Chancellor Scholz and also President Macron. The two diplomatic advisors were dispatched to the region at the beginning of September. We didn't know much about it, but slowly some more information came out that there is actually a proposal, Franco-German proposal, and it's some kind of a framework agreement. We still don't know the details, but your colleague, Ambassador Hill, at an interview in Voice of America said that soon we will be able to see something in writing, some more elaborations. But before I come to you, I want to start with you, Dusan. How do you see this? So obviously President Vučić has talked more than anyone else, maybe didn't reveal everything, maybe added few things that could possibly not be part of, I don't know, speculations. But this Franco-German initiative, how would that be taken in Serbia? Are there any signs that it will be actually considered with seriousness?
First of all, I have to say that I just partially informed. I saw something. I'm believing or not that is the right. And the first point is really last time that for both governments to publish that paper, to make them, public, and to all of it the serious discussions, which will help to the people, in my case, my president, my lady prime minister. I love them. That's the first point. Second point, you know very well, that's from 2012. I really think that spirit of two Germans model is something that only could help to normalization. That's appropriate spirit for normalization. It's not for conflict management, it's not so functional in the conflict resolution. And generally, it's my understanding of the first Brussels agreement is that that spirit is involved. And for that, just to finish, I know that Serbs are really genius to miss the opportunity, to make the wrong decisions. I could say directly, the best opportunity will not come. Please take the chance to challenge the reality, and the beginning is to realize that Kosovo really exists. After that, we will easier discuss with our friends, our neighbors.
I want to be a little bit agent provocateur, because you mentioned Germany, the basic treaty of '72. Well, recently we heard a lot of criticism on Ostpolitik, so Willy Brandt, who was the brains behind Germany Agreement or Basic Treaty, was also the one that followed Ostpolitik. And then, you know, this is not the panel about that, but recently we heard that Ostpolitik didn't bring, you know, a lot of good in recent days, or recent months, I would say. But leave that aside. Mr. Bislimi, so Ambassador Hill mentioned that we should focus on bigger issues. Of course, we talk about car plates and other agreements, but we shouldn't be doing that in light of what is happening in Europe, in light of all the troubles, the inflation, and so on and so forth. And I know that your government has also proposed a different agenda to the dialogue, which would look into bigger issues and not necessarily deal with all this for months and months and months. So to add to that, I also want to hear your views and the position of the government on the Franco-German initiative. So if you could share your insights with us.
Thank you very much. First, it was from the very beginning of Kurti II government the goal to deal with the broader picture and make sure that we focus on the main pillar also of Mr. Lajcak's mandate, which is to facilitate an agreement that will represent a full normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. And we had also the confirmation from Mr. Lajcak that this is also his intention. However, we were told that there are some issues that we cannot avoid on the way because all the agreements either were not implemented as they were supposed to, or they had clear deadlines. That's why we had to deal with the energy issue and with the license plates issue, not because we chose them, but the issues chose us. And we believe that this should be only technicalities that will not attract any public opinion interest. However, there were also participants that had a strong interest to make them important by threatening with tensions and other issues. Otherwise, we will not have been discussing them today. But from the very beginning, our interest was to look at the broader picture and start with the comprehensive normalization. If you remember, we also prepared a proposal on how this comprehensive normalization should look like. And we have submitted this to Mr. Lajcak, not in August 18th, when the last time when this publicly was discussed, but during the last quarter of 2021. So this is where the period when we started conversations on the elements of the comprehensive normalization. And if you remember, there were 6 elements that we thought, but we were willing to discuss with our counterparts on the reshaping of that document. The French-German initiative is not necessarily a German-German model, but I would say it's a German-German minus, because some of the important elements that you see in the German model are not available in the document that was disseminated to both parties. And I have to say that from the very beginning, the main difficulty with the dialogue process in Brussels is the divergence between the positions of two sides. For Kosovo, it's very important that we have a final document and it is centered around mutual recognition. For Serbia, it's very important that it's not a final document and it doesn't have inside the mutual recognition. So from that perspective, I will say that the French-German proposals or German-French proposals comes much closer to the Serbian position because it does not represent a final agreement and also it doesn't have this mutual recognition in this stage. But both sides have agreed that at this point it's not productive to reveal the document because it will kill the spirit of positive contribution toward getting a good result out of it. But it's up to the sides to decide when the right moment for its publishing is.
Thanks, Mr. Bislimi. Ambassador Hill, your colleague, Das Escobar, has spoken about this recently a bit more than when at the beginning the issue started coming out in the media. Like I mentioned just recently, he said that there will be more elaborations on the document soon. So I just I just wonder if you could share more insights with us on the document, but also on the position of your government. How much will they support the document? Will they be part of the document? Will they be the guarantors of the implementation?
I think it's fair to say, and without sharing elements of the document, because it's not mine to share, but I think it's fair to say the U.S. has been absolutely clear in its desire to support the European Union, in particular to support the efforts by the French and the Germans to try to find a more comprehensive approach to the problems. I think people who are not involved with the negotiations, and I'm not involved with the negotiations, as you correctly said, Mr. Escobar is, and of course Mr. Bislimi is. It's not for me to be sort of second-guessing people who are actually in the room and dealing with a tough situation. I do believe that with respect to terms like two Germanys. Well, Serbia is not Germany and Kosovo is not another Germany. So we know that these are more metaphors than specific, detailed plans. So I would urge people to sort of look at the music or listen to the music rather than try to read the words of what the two Germany approach meant. But I think what really does need to happen is there's got to be some improvement in tone. And right now the tone is not very good in the way people describe each other's motivations. Nikola pointed out very accurately that when you see negotiators blaming the other sides for impasses, they're kind of not ready for a solution. I think when you do these things, you really have to be very aware and constantly with a sort of compass in your hand of what you're trying to achieve. Because if you don't kind of have that sort of overall direction that you're aiming at, you can get involved in the emotion of the moment, and before you know it, you're kind of trapped, maybe even going in circles. I think one time when we were arriving in Sarajevo, it was right after the end of the siege of Sarajevo, day after the end of the siege, and no more artillery falling down in the center of Sarajevo. We went in to see then Alija Izetbegovic, and he and his team were kind of angry. Why did you stop the NATO bombing? And we said, well, we stopped the NATO bombing because we had an agreement on no more siege of the city. And there was a lot of criticism in that room of what we're doing. We walked outside onto the streets to get into our motorcade onto the streets of Sarajevo. And during the time we were inside, maybe 45 minutes, a large crowd had formed. And all these average citizens were out there applauding the fact that the siege was over. So if you sit inside a negotiation and you see people are kind of upset with each other and you think, oh, gee, maybe we did the wrong thing, I'm not sure. And then you go out and you see how people really felt about having cooking gas turned on, about having electricity turned on. You kind of realize what you should be doing. So as someone who's been involved in these negotiations, you hit something on Tuesday and you say, I'm not going to let them get away with that. So on Wednesday you work on it, on Thursday you work on it. And before you know it, you realize you've been involved in what you think is some kind of sporting event when it's really unimportant to what the overall direction should be. So I just hope there can be a renewal of interest in getting this done, and I'm very hopeful that without going into the details, the French and the Germans, they understand. They understand. Those countries actually, look at the history. It wasn't very kind to those countries either. So they have come together in a way that is just breathtaking in the last 75 years. So I think we ought to sort of take some sense of optimism from the people in the European Union and try to start picking up the pace to address these regional issues and make the Balkans. I mean, people always talk about, can Serbia move west? We all like Serbia to move west. We'd also like West to move to Serbia. We'd like to see Serbia in it, and we'd like to see Kosovo in it as well.
So on this note, I think most of us agree here that the tone has to improve. The narrative have to change because they have been quite damaging. As the US ambassador to Serbia, what would be your advice to this government to improve the tone and improve the narratives?
Well, you know, one thing when you're an ambassador and you're giving advice to the government, you don't do it
In public.
in conferences like this.
Very
It's
good.
totally ineffective. So you try to do it.
But I hope you will do it.
Yeah, I'm very active. I can assure you of that.
So, Jovana, I want to go to you now. If you could give us your thoughts on the bigger picture, on the Franco-German initiatives, and how do you see them kind of unfolding on the ground?
Well, it's very difficult for me to comment on it because it would be a speculation, because we only heard parts of it and different interpretation, but clearly all the sides confirmed that such document exists, and it's now a matter of time when we can actually see the document. But I think I want to return back to the fact that we are missing the good faith in the parties in the process. And I think this is something that we really need to find, because without the good faith, I don't really see the possibility of finding an agreement that is actually durable and sustainable. It is a big difference in comparison, for example, to reaching Prespa agreement, for example. The motives were just different. So the sides really need to readdress their priorities and kind of find themselves in a place where they actually can look into finding common interests. But also, with this proposal and with any other, I think it's really important to also kind of reflect back on the existing process and the guarantees of that what has been agreed is going to be implemented. For example, in this specific case, the ASM was brought up, and the question whether the ASM is going to be established before the whole new process starts or is going to be a part of this new package of negotiations, which is very concerning from the perspective of, okay, we have been agreed on something, it has been put on paper. In the case of Kosovo, the parliament even ratified it. There was a constitutional court ruling that also said that there needs to be an establishment, that Kosovo authorities still refuse to do so. This doesn't show the good faith. Of course, there are downsides in the behavior of the both parties in the process. Not, there is not one party that is better than the other. It is just the way of the format and kind of the how people perceive what is important to them. And maybe a suggestion coming from the ground and as the civil society, these decisions have to be citizen-centered. They really need to take into consideration the needs of the communities, because we are those that are going to be living the consequences of these agreements, and the agreements really need to make our lives easier. So this is something that I would like to see.
Great. So, Nikola, I come back to the question of lessons learned. So, obviously there is a momentum now that the parties should be using, and Europe also should be using this momentum. There are all the right statements coming out of Europe in recent months. But what lessons would you share that would be useful to the process of the dialogue process between Kosovo and Serbia, from your experience during the Prespa agreement?
Yes. Well, there are several, and I don't think I'm going to exhaust them all, given the time frame. Trust is very important, and you have to build it. Some measures, trust-building, confidence-building measures, will help. Tone is important. I remember in a later stage, there is an interesting phasing in a negotiation process. The blame game ends, then you carefully examine the others. Both parties sort of grow up from protecting positions into promoting interests. Then there is a phase where you try to make a combination where the interests of both parties are addressed. And I and my counterpart, I think we learned the sensitivities of the other as if they were our own sensitivities. So I remember when giving interviews, I would think my public, their public, the region, the European public. You also have to recognize that political capital will be spent. And on these sort of issues that are decades old, there is probably, hopefully, a return on the political capital spent, but it doesn't come soon. It will take some years for people to realize this was worth doing. So I think a recognition that you will be less popular is part of making an agreement happen. Another, which was important for many of my compatriots, there is a role for the EU accession process here. I would have done this, and I think it was worth doing even without the EU promise. But for many, this was key because we lost generations because of the name issue stuck in the waiting room of the EU. 17 years a candidate country. And this was the reason. So promises were made by European leaders. You do this, your journey starts. You name them, they were in Skopje, or at least by sending video messages. This promise was not met. So the seriousness, the credibility of what the EU does in this region, is membership really on the table? Is it realistic? Can we touch it? Can we see it? That will make a difference, I think, for both parties involved here. At the same time, I have to nuance this. It cannot be only about solution of bilateral disputes, because the EU process, as we know, is also about transformation and Copenhagen criteria. So the question, if there is a solution of the Serbia-Kosovo issue, do we make Serbia a member state tomorrow, the next day? Probably not. Other things will have to. So, but EU must be serious about this region, and this will very much help. Now, even without them, these are our lives, these are our countries, this is our region. Is it worth solving our problems? Yes. But they can be helpful. And I think the involvement here is heavier. In the PRESPA process, it was mostly the countries. We had some help occasionally, facilitation when we had some hiccups. There was a lot of people at the signing for the photo op. When there is success, people are there to take the credit. Some people should not have been there, if you ask me.
Yeah.
So,
But you'll live with it. Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's done.
Yeah.
Ideally, it would have been great to have a European in the panel, but we don't have that. And on this note, I want to open it up for questions. Aha, there we go. That was quick.
Hi. Hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting and enlightening panel. My question would be directed to Ambassador Hill and on two issues specifically. The first one, or also to Mr. Bislimi, if you'd like to answer. The Kosovo side has been very unwilling to extend the deadline on license plates after it was requested by Representative Escobar after his recent meetings in Belgrade. How do you see, and there have been accusations from Western governments that Kosovo has been, under Kurti, amping up the sort of confrontational stance towards the Serbian side. That's the first question. The second question, since I have you there and you must be into this, how do you see, been following this, how do you see the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, having in mind that the U.S.'s support for the changes in the electoral law there have led to the biggest fall in support for U.S. presence in Bosnia since the end of the war? Thank you.
There's another question at the back. We take another question, and then we go back to the panel.
Thank you very much, Engjellushe. My question is also for Ambassador Hill, who, Chris, I don't consider you wrapped up at all. So I can, quite the opposite. So here's my question for you. Quite correctly and aptly, you said how disappointed you are that there's a focus on these issues, license plates and so forth, while this appalling war, and I agree, appalling war in Ukraine rages with even threat of nuclear weapons. So I'm wondering if disappointment was your reaction to the decision of Serbia to sign basically a friendship pact with Russia at the UN on American soil, with not just with Russia, but with a sanctioned Russian official, Sergei Lavrov, right after the Serbian president, Alexander Vučić, had met with Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and then Toria Nuland. And I just wonder, as an American, as a citizen, as someone who's worked in this region for many years, if the conclusion is rather conviction, that we now know the answer to the question, which side Belgrade is on, at least in the person of the president, who seems to act as if there's no consequences for such activities. And then that relates, of course, to the issue of Kosovo. And I want to address the title here, is Escaping the Dead End. I'm wondering if your colleague, Gabriel Escobar, in fact, did address that question. He gave an interview in Pristina on the 19th, and he said these words, which I thought were quite significant. I'd never heard from a U.S. official. In answer to the question about mutual recognition, he said that what's even more important, the most important thing for Kosovo, more important than any other process, that's a quote, Gabe said this, is recognition from the European non-recognizers, the countries that do not recognize Kosovo. And I'm wondering if, in fact, that is the answer to the dead end, because that then creates the opportunity that Jovana quite correctly said, neither side is good or bad, but that removes the structural obstacle, and then Serbia and Kosovo could finally negotiate on even terms a dignified settlement that'll leave Jovana and her fellow citizens in good shape. Thank you.
Ambassador Hill, may I suggest that we take Mr. Bislimi's answer, if you want to come in, because there was a question for you as well, and then we'll go.
Okay, but you're going to have to help me with all those questions, because I can't remember that kind of thing, you know. Function of seniority, I think.
Mr. Bislimi, exactly.
First, I'm sorry. The time allocation was not enough for me also to share some of the experiences that I think have prevented a more successful process in Brussels until now. But to focus on the question, I think the way how the question was stated somehow puts government of Kosovo in a negative spotlight. So there is an unwillingness from Kosovo to extend the deadline. So pretty much the impression might be that there is demand there, but time was not enough, so there is a need for extension. But I would want just in 30 seconds to explain the narrative. The reason why there was a request for extension was because there was a concern about the huge disinformation campaign that Vučić offered to the citizens, Kosovo citizens in the northern municipalities. And there was a huge concern about the threats that parallel structure, illegal structure financed from Belgrade provided the citizens in the north. And there was a concern that Vučić is ready and willing to start tensions over a very, very basic issue. This was the background for the extension. But there was no shortage of the capacities to respond to the demand from the citizens. Despite this, the main request was to make sure that we do not confirm some of the fears that Mr. Vučić spread over the last weeks. He also talked about surrender. our languages comply with the legislation. We believe that surrender is only a concept that criminals use when they discuss with the government institutions, and we would not want to see the citizens put in that corner. But we were told, and we were willing to cooperate in finding a mechanism that makes sure that the transition is softened, so that the willingness of citizens to comply with the rule of law gets increased.
Thank you, Mr. Bislimi. Ambassador Hill.
So where do I start? I've kind of lost track. Well, this was on the issue of the extension of the deadline? Yeah.
That's right.
All right. First of all, I want to make another point. When you're in the middle of a negotiation, you have to kind of create the circumstance where you can see your counterpart the next day. And sometimes there's a real desire, and I was dealing with North Korea. There's nothing, I mean, about North Koreans, you know, you just got to pick them up and hug them. I mean, they're just impossible people, to be frank. But when you're negotiating with them, you don't get up one day in front of CNN and say they're impossible people. You just don't do that because you have to see them the next day. And so you try to tone it down even if you have a lot of concerns. You try to make sure that you create the circumstance where you can sit and talk. You know, I mean, for example, I wish Mr. Bislimi were here. I wish whatever the circumstance that led him to come halfway up to Serbia and then go back, I wish he had been here. But you know, this has not just been his problem, it's also been the Serbian negotiators' problem when he's tried to get to Kosovo. So I think there have been some real problems in the kind of tone of how to manage this thing. Now, getting on to the issue of license plates, it was, we should just not call this escaping the dead end, we should call this escaping the license plate conundrum. But yeah. I think the problem is that the European Union took a look at what happened at the end of July and said, my goodness, you know, wars have been fought over, you know, land and money, and here this war, you know, might have a war over license plates. I think they were kind of worried about it. So they said, let's look at this. Let's kind of recalibrate and look at this from a very broad perspective. And let's ask people, look, let's put aside this license plate issue. And so they asked. And the U.S., because we support the European Union, made very clear we also wanted the license plate issue put off. And not just, you know, a couple of weeks or something. We wanted it put off because it isn't going to get us in the direction of where we need to go. So there's an effort to say, look, everyone can keep their positions on license plates, but please, let's give us some space to work on stuff. So that's the first thing. And I think Mr. Escobar made that very clear. The second question...
So there was a question on Bosnia.
Yeah, I really can't help her on Bosnia. I mean, that's been a tough issue. I know there are a lot of concerns about how the elections were run in Republika Srpska. I know that ultimately the Central Election Commission decided by a vote of 6-1 to go ahead and certify. So I'm really kind of the wrong ambassador to ask about that. There are lots of people working on Bosnia.
And then there were questions from Ed on the signing of the agreement in U.S. soil, as he put it, and then the mentioning of the 5 non-recognizers from by Das Escobar in an interview in Pristina.
With due respect to my good friend Ed, the non-recognizers have their own reasons for non-recognizing. And I think you'd have to ask them why they're non-recognizing, but they have, in some cases, very principled positions on it. And, you know, the Spanish ambassador got up, actually in this room just a few weeks ago when the Spanish had their National Day, and he said, we are guided by 1244, period. It's probably not something everyone in Kosovo would have liked to hear, but he made that very clear. 1244 is our guide, and we feel we're kind of in uncharted waters. So you have to ask the non-recognizers. I think the best thing for the non-recognizers is to see that Serbia, Serbs in Kosovo Albanians have understood they're both going to be around for a long time. They're both going to be neighbors for a long time. They're going to have to figure out a way to work with each other. I don't think anyone wants to see frozen conflicts. I don't think people want to see kind of this thing to go on and on. So I think it kind of puts the onus to say, look, we'll help you. We'll try to mediate these things. We'll try to bring some serious attention at a very senior level. And believe me, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France have other things they're doing, and yet they're prepared to do this. And I think they're all looking for a broader solution. And they're not expecting it to happen overnight. You know, usually these problems don't get solved overnight, but they're kind of suggesting, hey, this shouldn't go on for years or even months. Come on, let's try to get focused on this in a time of weeks. And I hope that people who live here in the Balkans, and by the way, I don't want to miss Nikola's very important point about we need some regional thinking here. You know, if you're the European Union, you don't want to be bringing in countries that have all these disputes with each other. So we'd like to see a sort of regional dimension to this. So, you know, I would like to say, I don't think this is insolvable by any means, but I think people need to tone it down and figure out how to talk to each other and understand if you say something impolite to someone on a Tuesday, don't expect to have a good negotiation on a Wednesday. It doesn't work that way. And marriage, it doesn't work that way in anything. So you have to kind of tone it down.
Can I ask if there are any more questions? No, yes. There is one, and then that would be the last question, unless there is another.
My name is Dodo Costa. I'm ambassador from Romania, by the way. I have a question of concerning a comment that was made by one of the distinguished panelists about credibility that EU efforts, decisions, and so on and so forth, how this credibility is faring in the region. And I'd like also to have your views on representing the respective parties in this file, whether you think you have done everything possible to have this issue settled. Thank you.
Since we're past our time, I want to add to that, if we could, and then have the final round, starting with you, Jovana. I want to ask, so there is this momentum, there is intensified efforts, US will be there to support. What if there is no agreement, and come 24, we all hear this by now, that there will be elections in Europe, elections in the US, and hopefully not, but Balkan issues, regional issues will be marginalized. So if we could use our imagination and just, you know, say a couple of words about what if there is no agreement, what happens past 24? We start with you, Jovana, and then you can, Nikola, you can add your answer to the final comments as well.
Well, thank you. I mean, we're definitely entering the window of opportunity for the next 2 years with no elections and a great possibility to move things forward. But unfortunately, I'm a pessimist. Maybe if you asked me 6-7 months ago, I would probably tell a different story. And that's when the moment a group of civil society activists from Kosovo and Serbia worked on developing these 4 scenarios of Kosovo-Serbia relations in 5 years' time. And back then, when we were looking at it, came with the most optimistic scenario, and to us, that was the most likely scenario. It meant moving forward in certain aspects and reaching an agreement, not the recognition, but still a significant moving forward in the improvement of the relations. In the meantime, from April to now, the situation drastically changed. And we are now in the third scenario, how we called it, in the uncharted waters, unfortunately, and we are at the brink of the conflict, unfortunately. I think this newest decision of the Kosovo government postponing the inevitable if we don't address the burning issue adequately. So this is maybe a warning for all of us to really come back and readdress in order to avoid a much more grim scenario in the future.
Thanks, Jovana. Nikola.
Yes, if I understood the question correctly, I mean, EU bashing is sometimes a sport, including within member states. So this was not my intention, but I think among friends we have to be honest, there is an issue in the citizens of the Balkans believing that the promise of Thessaloniki 2003 or Zagreb 2000 is really there. The simple passage of time, and we are not inherently less capable than other European nations that made the journey from Central Europe, from the Baltics, etc. So I don't think that we are ready to join now. Probably no country is. But my country, North Macedonia, has been ready to start accession talks for a long time. And if you look at the report of the Commission, we are actually on overall preparedness with better marks than Serbia after 8 years in the accession talks. So, and the Commission has been recommending, they're ready, let them start since 2009. This is 13 years ago. There are some Reporters Beyond Borders indexes where several candidate countries from the region are actually faring better than member states from the broader region. So it's a shared burden. We are far from perfect, all of us in this region, but we have an issue with credibility that we have to address. And it's not helpful where, mixed signals. I mean, this is our continent, we need one narrative. Are we going to settle with different Europes? Are we going to fight to have one Europe whole and free, where corruption is not tolerated? Or are we going to tolerate corruption in some countries and we're going to protect the core? So these questions are not really answered today. And last sentence on the topic. We settled for a compromise that was unthinkable when we started the process, and the same for the Greeks. So I think this is also an important lesson, because we evolved in the process. This is not an advice, I'm just sharing the experience. And between neighbors, you cannot win. It cannot be a zero-sum equation. If one neighbor feels they're at a loss, the problem is there. And this is why it was not helpful that after we did it, for us it was Macedonian language and identity, for the Greeks, a clear distinction between Greek Macedonia and Macedonia, the country that is now North Macedonia. It was not helpful that the next challenge from another neighbor targeted Macedonian language. So I think we deserve a pat. This has become such a tiny, steep line to work towards the EU.
Thanks, Nikola. Final remarks, Ambassador Hill?
Let me just make a couple of kind of random remarks, if you will. One, I think there's a lot, this is a part of the world that is truly burdened by history. And there's a reason for that. There's a lot of bad history here. And I think there has to be a greater sense of, if you're going to focus on history, and if you're going to remember so well, keep something else in mind, and that is resiliency. Keep in mind the idea that everybody is here because they've overcome some history, not that they've succumbed to the history. So I think it's very important that everybody has this sense of resiliency, and with resiliency comes with some self-confidence and an ability, if not to forget, if not even to fully forgive, but at least to move on. And I think that's important. Second point, and I pick up on Nikola's point about neighborhood. You know, I spent a lot of time in Poland, and a few assignments there and working on Poland from Washington. And in the early years of the expectation that there would be an accession process, we're talking 1990s, there was a lot of sort of unpleasant competition between Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. You know, it was just kind of unpleasant. It was always, pick me, I'm better than this guy, pick me, and, you know, et cetera. And so then the leaders of these countries got together in a place called Visegrad. Not the Visegrad that we all know here. It was, I think it was in Czech Republic, maybe Hungary. There are a lot of Visegrads. And the idea, they came out of it with something called the Visegrad process, and it really held. And the concept was to say, stop denigrating the other guy. Understand that ultimately, if you're going to succeed, you need a good neighborly relationship. And sure enough, they all came into the European Union together. So think Visegrad. And finally, because I never did get to Ed Joseph's provocative point about that, let me be diplomatic, very unfortunate piece of paper that was signed with the Russians. These are emotional issues, but I think Serbia has come to understand that this is not your mother's Russia. This is a very different Russia now. But there is a lot of emotion here, a lot of reasons why there have been these ties, you know, whether it's church or something else, or a lot of different reasons. I think, my opinion, Serbs understand this. And I think the issue is to help Serbia understand it and help them make this journey westward. This doesn't come naturally. I mean, we have a country that was the heir to the idea that we're not north, we're not south, we're not east, we're not west, we're special, you know, this kind of whole mentality. So don't think it's easy just to say, you should never talk to another Russian again in Serbia, you bad boy. It's not that easy. It's not easy at all. But I think there's a case where you look at your own interests and you say, what are our interests? Are our interests in seeing Serbia somehow tied up with Russia, or so that we can blame Serbia for it? Or are our interests tied up in the idea of helping Serbia make that journey westward? I think Serbia's young people have made that decision, but I think it's a work in progress, and it's worth doing, not only because I think it's in Serbia's interest, but I think it's in all of our interests. So I think we ought to be helping rather than criticizing.
Dusan.
Oh, all my life, I'm trying to escape the finals, especially final solutions, final remarks. I will make two remarks. The first about the question of credibility of EU, not facilitation. That's something that has to be used and has to be developed. The credibility of the envoyers is quite questionable. And in this very moment, we have a really good move with help from Paris, Washington, London, don't forget UK, never, and Berlin with special envoyers who are going to help to light check. That is needed. If I could ask the members, government of the member states of you, please stop to nominate the special envoyers. You know, that's like money. If you have so many envoyers, that's hyperinflation. That's first. And the second, it's about, completely agree about Visegrad experience in negotiation with Brussels bureaucracy. It's the good approach. But maybe we have to go deeper in history. Benelux. In this very moment, open Balkan, does not matter how that was. Calling was one idea, I think, in Ohrid, that has to be developed some kind of the communication in the energy sector to bring together companies, private people, people who are thinking how to come to the with joint efforts, the energy security, including food. That's for and I'm finishing, for my opinion, that's the right response on two things. The first of all, Ukraine-Russia war and crisis, and the serious crisis of the globalization. Only way for the small countries to escape, to be eliminated in this crisis, is to cooperate in the regional level, especially these 6 countries. They have a really good opportunity in energy sector. Thank you.
We are so much out
One
of time.
sentence only.
Well, okay,
to-
one sentence.
Chris inspired me with the history point, and to end it in the Prespa spirit, quoting Nikos Koutsias, who said, history should be a teacher, not a prison. So I think that this puts, it's a good lesson for the region.
Mr. Bislimi, final remarks and final words from you.
Thank you very much, Engjellushe. I want to close this by stating 3 determinants behind our increased efforts to conclude the agreement as soon as possible. On one extreme, we have this window of opportunity that you and Jovana mentioned, a golden period of no election cycles in either of the parties here, but also in some of the crucial members of the international community. The second determinant is the other extreme of geopolitical implications that are arising from the war in Ukraine. And the third determinant is the fact that the longer the crisis continues, the longer we don't have this final full normalization of relation, the longer our citizens and the business community will not be able to exploit all potential for development. However, in the meantime, we have to show that in addition to our strong willingness to be active and constructive and work for the faster finalization of the agreement, we also have to make sure that we are not hostage of the process. So we try to show that despite all the barriers that we have in the international trade, in the international flow of goods, that we can still grow faster than expected. As Nikola mentioned, in many aspects, the region can perform maybe even better than EU members. I want to point out that economic growth in Kosovo was double-digit, the only country maybe in Europe, that we managed to increase or strengthen the rule of law, and this was also certified in all international rankings, both in the World Justice Index, but Transparency International. And also, we managed to organize elections at the highest standards and comparable to those of the EU members. However, I will want to say that we still want to have the process finalized in Brussels. But if the process in Brussels is lasting for more than 11 years and still failing to produce the final agreement, if this final agreement is relevant to all of us, we should not be shy to review the process and see what are the factors that have prevented the process for bringing out this final solution. Whether it has to do something with the credibility of the process, whether it has to do something with the lack of clear goals of the process, whether it has to do something with the missing deadlines for success, whether it has to do with the disproportionate distribution of the bargaining power, whether it has to do, as Ed mentioned, with the 5 non-recognizers, or it has something to do with the willingness and ability and the strong vision of the mediator. I think we should not be shy to ask all the questions and make sure that we remove them or remove every obstacle that prevents us from coming to the conclusion. And I agree with Nikola that in all this process, mutual trust is crucial. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for joining us online, Mr. Bislimi. It's quite unfortunate that you couldn't be here, but still, we managed to pull it together. Thank you to the organizers, first of all. I'm not going to try and wrap up this panel, especially since we have been, I'm being told that we should move. But thank you so much. Please, everyone, join me in thanking all the panelists for their great contribution.